In the silence of the desert, something still breathes beneath the sand. Names long erased, promises buried in dust, destinies forgotten by time. Abraham, the father of nations, a man whose story was supposed to be finished. But what if it wasn't? What if after Sarah's death, heaven opened one last chapter, a chapter no one was meant to see? Her name flickers once, a single verse in Genesis. Keturah, a whisper in scripture, yet a storm in history. A woman whose bloodline shaped empires, whose children carried the shadow of Abraham into lands that would one day become nations. For centuries, her name was sealed behind theology, her story hidden from pulpits, erased from memory. But when you follow the trail of forgotten verses, you find her standing there between promise and mystery. Who was Keturah? A second wife, a stranger from the east, or the missing key in God's unfolding covenant, a bridge between Israel and the nations. They called her fragrance, but her presence burned like incense in the unseen places of history. Through her womb, kingdoms were born. Through her silence, prophecies breathed. And through her story, God whispered, "I am not finished yet." This is not the tale of a forgotten woman. It is the revelation of a forgotten covenant. A hidden alliance written not in ink, but in blood, sand, and divine intention. This is the story of Keturah and Abraham, the forgotten marriage that changed nations. Now, the dust parts, the tent opens, and the journey begins. After Sarah's death, the desert seemed to exhale. The night winds carried no laughter, no echo of her voice. Abraham, the friend of God, sat beneath the stars, his eyes tracing the constellations that once spoke of promise. He had seen fire fall upon Sodom. He had heard angels call his name. He had bound his own son upon an altar. Every trial complete, every word fulfilled. Or so he thought. He was 137 years old. Too old, it seemed, for beginnings. Yet the God who breathed life into dust was not finished breathing. Somewhere beyond the dunes, a woman was walking toward him, her name carried on the wind. Keturah. It means fragrance. But her arrival was more than a scent, it was an intervention. The scriptures mention her in one verse almost as a footnote, and yet that verse conceals a miracle, because when God writes footnotes, they echo louder than entire histories. Abraham, the patriarch of promise, took her as his wife, and suddenly time reversed. The man who once laughed at the thought of fatherhood and old age now laughed again, this time not in disbelief, but in wonder. The world might see an old man clinging to a shadow of youth, but heaven saw something else, the continuation of covenant, the widening of a divine plan. For even after Sarah, even after Isaac, God was still multiplying the seed of promise through another vessel, another destiny. And through that union, life erupted once more. The barren tent became a cradle of nations. Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shuah. 6 sons, 6 nations born from a man whose body should have been long silent. What kind of strength is that? What kind of faith remains after loss, after death, after fulfillment? Abraham didn't chase legacy, legacy chased him. Because when God makes a promise, he doesn't stop at enough. He always creates more. And so in the quiet after heartbreak, a new chapter began. A chapter few dared to notice. One that would reach beyond Canaan, beyond Israel, into the heart of Arabia and the mysteries of prophecy. But who was this woman? This silent figure stepping out of Scripture's shadow? Where did she come from and why her? Perhaps her name fragrance holds the first clue. Because before every offering, before every revelation, God lights the incense. And as her story begins to rise from the smoke of history, one truth becomes clear. The covenant of Abraham was never finished. Keturah. The name drifts through Scripture like a whisper of smoke, fragrant, brief, and easily forgotten. Yet in Hebrew, Keturah means incense, the aroma of worship that rises to heaven. A name like that is not given by accident. Incense was sacred. It was the symbol of prayers ascending, of covenant restored. Could it be that her very name was prophecy, that her presence was not merely romantic, but redemptive? Some ancient rabbis believed she came from the tribes of Sheba or Dedan regions rich with spice, gold, and myrrh. Others claimed she was of Hamitic descent, linking her blood to Africa's early dynasties. But the most haunting theory is that she was Hagar returned under a new name. If that is true, then history itself bends, because the woman once cast out would now be welcomed home. The exile becomes the bride. The rejected becomes the redeemed. The same tent where Sarah once dwelled, now filled with the fragrance of reconciliation. The same Abraham who once sent Hagar into the wilderness, now reaching out his hand to her again, not in guilt, not in weakness, but in grace. This is not merely romance. This is redemption written in human form. The God who once told Abraham to let her go now writes her back into the story. And that is the first great mystery of Keturah. She represents the God who restores what man divides. But perhaps there's more. For even if she was not Hagar, even if she was a new woman entirely, her arrival still carries the scent of divine timing. It was no accident that she appeared after Sarah's death. When the covenant seemed complete, God opened another door one history almost missed. This was never about replacing Sarah. It was about completing what Sarah began. Because Abraham's story was not the tale of one nation, but the seed of many. Through Keturah, the promise expands. Through her, the borders of blessing stretch eastward toward the lands that would one day cradle Arabia, Edom, and Midian. The covenant was no longer confined to the blood of Isaac. It was spreading like the scent of incense on the desert wind. And so Keturah becomes more than a woman, she becomes a message. Her very silence in Scripture speaks of hidden purpose. She enters quietly, but her legacy roars across generations. Every time the priests burned incense in the temple, its smoke rose as a memory, a reminder that God remembers even those the world forgets. And perhaps in that fragrance, the name of Keturah still lingers, because in the economy of heaven, nothing forgotten remains lost. The second mystery of Keturah is that she is both the fragrance and the fire, the sweet aroma of worship and the spark of divine multiplication. She stands as proof that God's promises never die, they transform. That even after loss, even after silence, He still writes new beginnings in the ashes of the old. What chapters of your life have seemed too far gone to reopen? Where have you assumed the story was finished? Maybe you are living your own Keturah moment, a divine continuation no one saw coming. And as her fragrance fills the pages once more, we are left with a single burning question. Who were these sons born from her womb, and what destiny did they carry into the deserts of time? 3 women, 3 covenants within one man's destiny, each of them carrying a fragment of God's eternal plan, Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah. They are not rivals in a household. They are revelations in flesh. Sarah, the mother of laughter, the fulfillment of divine timing. Hagar, the outcast, the mercy found in human error. Keturah, the fragrance of abundance, the continuation beyond all expectation. Together they form a trinity of revelation, promise, grace, and overflow, each one a different face of the same faith. Sarah was the beginning, the impossible birth. Her womb, once barren, became the vessel of the covenant itself. Isaac, her son, embodied the laughter of a promise fulfilled against all odds. Through her, God proved that time bends to His word. But every promise brings a test. When impatience met prophecy, Hagar entered the story, an Egyptian servant carrying the son of human will. Her child Ishmael was not a mistake. He was a mirror revealing how God can turn even missteps into mercy. Hagar's tears in the wilderness still echo through the sands. She named God El Roi, the God who sees me. That moment rewrote the theology of the forgotten. It declared that heaven watches the castaway just as closely as the chosen. And then, silence. Decades pass. Sarah dies. The tent grows cold. The covenant seems complete. But when men think the book has closed, God adds another chapter. Keturah enters, not to replace, but to reveal the abundance beyond the promise. Where Sarah gave one son, Keturah would give 6. Where Hagar's story ended in exile, Keturah's begins in restoration. She stands as proof that God's blessings are not linear, they multiply. Sarah's faith opened the covenant. Hagar's pain expanded its mercy. Keturah's womb unleashed its fullness. And together they show that God's plan has always included both the chosen and the forgotten, both the miracle and the mistake, both the laughter and the silence. Isaac fathers Jacob, Jacob fathers Israel. But the sons of Keturah, Midian, Sheba, Dedan, they scatter eastward, shaping nations that will one day cross paths with prophets and kings. Even Moses, the lawgiver, will find refuge in the house of Jethro, a priest from the line of Keturah. History comes full circle. The covenant born in Canaan is sheltered by the children of a forgotten wife. And through that, God whispers a truth deeper than lineage, that no seed of Abraham is ever wasted. Every woman, every birth, every exile, each plays a role in the divine architecture of redemption. Sarah, Hagar, Keturah, 3 fragrances blending into one covenant incense rising through the corridors of time. And so the story expands beyond Israel, beyond bloodlines and borders, toward a prophecy that unites nations. Because when God builds a legacy, he writes it through contrast, through promise, pain, and abundance intertwined. What kind of God multiplies blessing through the forgotten? And what hidden miracle was still waiting in Abraham's old age? Abraham was an old man. Not just in years in memory, in battle and sorrow. He had lived through kingdoms rising and falling, through famines, wars, and promises that stretched the limits of reason. At 130 years old, his body bore the map of time, every wrinkle a road, every scar a story. But the God who first called him under the stars was not finished writing. The scriptures record it simply. Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. But behind that line lies one of the most extraordinary miracles in all of human history. For what man in his twilight could father 6 sons, what human strength could kindle new life from dust and ashes? This was not biology, this was prophecy. Abraham's body, once considered as good as dead, was revived not once, but twice. The same divine energy that brought forth Isaac in his old age now surged again, as if heaven refused to let the covenant end. God does not follow the rhythm of human decline. Where men see an ending, he sees a womb. Where time draws a line, eternity begins a new sentence. Abraham's tent, silent since Sarah's laughter faded, now echoed again with the cries of newborn sons. 6 sons, 6 nations, each one a living testimony that divine promises have no expiration date. And yet this miracle was not about reproduction. It was about revelation. God was revealing his nature, that fruitfulness is not bound to youth, that purpose is not buried with age, that faith, when tested, can resurrect even the dust. For Abraham, this was not a second chance at family. It was a second breath of destiny. He had already seen God provide a ram in the thicket, already seen covenant blood spilled on an altar, and yet heaven whispered again, there is still more. Every time Keturah held a child in her arms, the promise of God expanded. Every birth was a declaration, my word will not return void. But imagine the whispers of the tribes around them, the disbelief, the laughter, the rumor. How could the old patriarch father nations again? They didn't understand that when God breathes on a man's life, even the barren years become fertile ground. Perhaps that's why God waited until 130. To prove that what he begins in faith, he sustains beyond strength. It wasn't romance, it was revelation. A supernatural continuation of covenant. A quiet miracle that defied every law of time and flesh. And so through Keturah, the fire in Abraham's lineage burned brighter. He was not merely the father of Isaac. He became the father of nations uncounted, spanning from Canaan to Arabia, from prophecy to eternity. God's blessings do not age. His promises do not retire. Even the dust of your past can bloom again when he speaks. If this story stirs something within you, pause for a moment. Let your heart respond. Comment what impossible promise you still believe God can fulfill. because someone else reading may need your faith tonight. And as we follow this miraculous legacy, we must ask, who were these sons born of a resurrected covenant? And what destinies did they carry into the wilderness of history? Keturah bore Abraham 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah. 6 names often read rarely remembered, yet within them lie the birth certificates of empires. Each name carried destiny. Each son became the root of a people spreading eastward from Canaan into the deserts of Arabia. They were not mere wanderers, they were founders of dynasties, merchants of gold, keepers of prophecy in lands beyond Israel's reach. Zimran's descendants settled near the Red Sea, their ships trading ivory, myrrh, and incense, the same treasures later offered to a child born in Bethlehem. Jokshan's sons, Sheba and Dedan, would give rise to the great spice kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula tribes, whose wealth and mystery would fill Solomon's courts with wonder. Their caravans moved like rivers of fire under the desert sun, carrying the aroma of Keturah's legacy. Medan and Ishbak spread toward the north, their bloodlines mingling with the Midianites and Edomites, forging alliances that would echo for centuries. And Shuah the youngest, his name would survive in the book of Job, a friend from the east named Bildad the Shuhite, perhaps a descendant of this forgotten branch. But one name towers above them all: Midian. For through Midian came a people destined for an encounter with the divine. Generations later, a fugitive from Egypt would flee into their land, a man named Moses. There in the wilderness of Midian, he would meet Jethro, a priest descended from Keturah's line. And through that priest, Moses would find both wisdom and a wife, Zipporah. The lawgiver of Israel was mentored by a descendant of Abraham's forgotten sons. The covenant's flame had never died. It had only moved east, burning quietly in tents far from Jerusalem. History, it seems, does not forget what heaven ordains. Even when Scripture falls silent, the promise keeps walking barefoot across centuries. Every tribe born from Keturah carried a fragment of the blessing woven through trade routes, languages, and lineages. They became the unseen arteries through which God's covenant flowed into the nations. While Isaac's line bore the Messiah, Keturah's line carried the message, preparing roads, building nations, shaping the very world that would one day receive the Word made flesh. 6 sons, 6 nations, and through them the sixfold echo of Abraham's promise: in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the question is not whether God kept his word, but how many ways he fulfilled it in places no one thought to look. And yet this story is not without mystery. For though these sons built kingdoms, Scripture says Abraham sent them away eastward, bearing gifts carrying destinies that would unfold beyond the borders of Israel. Why would the Father of nations send his own blood into exile? What secret purpose lay hidden in that departure? Genesis 25:6. A single verse, brief and quiet. Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away, eastward to the land of the east. It reads like a gentle footnote, but behind that silence lies one of the most profound mysteries in all of Scripture. Why would the Father of many nations send his own sons away? Why scatter what God had just multiplied? Why let 6 nations vanish into the sands of time, unnamed, uncelebrated, unrecorded? At first glance, it seems like rejection, but it wasn't. It was alignment. Abraham was not dividing his legacy, he was expanding it. The covenant was not confined to tents and borders. It was designed to move like the wind of the Spirit that would later rush through Pentecost. Every son carried a portion of that divine inheritance, a spark of promise sealed within their bloodline. He gave them gifts, the Hebrew word matanot, not merely possessions, but blessings, insights, sacred knowledge. These were not payments to leave, they were seeds to plant. Abraham, guided by revelation, sent them eastward toward the lands that would one day cradle empires and prophecies. The east, a direction symbolizing dawn beginnings, revelation. Even their exile had a purpose, because God's story was never meant to be told in one language or through one people or in one land. It had to travel to Egypt, to Arabia, to the far horizons of the ancient world. The sons of Keturah became bridges, silent messengers carrying fragments of the covenant to the nations. Though scripture grows quiet about them, their fingerprints appear in ancient traditions, in the wisdom of the East, in the echoes of stories that still bear traces of the God of Abraham. Perhaps this is why the Bible leaves them unnamed beyond the list, because their story was meant to be hidden in plain sight, waiting for those who would seek it. Even silence can be sacred. Even exile can be part of divine orchestration. When God scatters, he is not discarding, he is sowing. Abraham's tent may have divided, but heaven's promise multiplied. And so the East became filled with his legacy, echoes of faith scattered across sands and centuries. Even in their silence, they fulfilled prophecy, because God's plan is never limited to one lineage. Maybe your life has felt like that, sent away, unseen, forgotten. But even in the East of your own exile, you carry something sacred. Share in the comments, what gifts do you think God has hidden within your silence? And as the dust settles on this forgotten part, a new question rises like the morning sun. What became of Keturah's legacy, and how does it still shape the world we live in today? Her descendants appear again and again, not in the spotlight but in the margins where history forgets to look. Yet the fingerprints of Keturah's bloodline trace through the pages of scripture, quiet but undeniable. It was Midianite traders who found Joseph in a pit, lifted him from despair, and carried him to Egypt. They thought they were selling a slave, but heaven knew they were transporting destiny. Without them, Joseph would never have entered Pharaoh's court, and the chain of salvation would have been broken. Even when they didn't know it, the sons of Keturah were part of the divine conspiracy, the unseen hands that moved prophecy forward. Centuries later, another child of Abraham would flee into their lands, a man named Moses, wanted for murder, hunted by Egypt. He sought refuge in Midian, the house of Jethro, a priest descended from Keturah's line. And there in the wilderness, the outcast of Israel was taught by the wisdom of the East. Jethro blessed him, mentored him, and through that union came Zipporah, Moses' wife, joining once again the divided branches of Abraham's family tree. From the forgotten wife came the priest who would bless the prophet. From Keturah's tent came the hands that prepared the leader of the Exodus. Through her legacy, the covenant found its breath again in exile. And this thread does not end there. Her nations, Sheba, Dedan, Midian, appear again in the words of the prophets. Isaiah names them among those who will one day bring offerings to Zion, carrying gold and incense in honor of the Lord. Habakkuk describes God's glory shining from Teman and Mount Paran regions, born of Keturah's sons. Even David in his Psalms sings of the kings of Sheba and Seba bringing gifts to the Messiah. The story that began in Abraham's twilight reaches into the messianic dawn. The nations birthed in silence return in song, worshiping the same God their forefather knew. Keturah's name may vanish from the text, but her fragrance never faded. It drifted through the centuries, woven into trade routes, prophecies, and pilgrimages, until it became part of redemption itself. The forgotten marriage became a bridge between covenants, between the promise of one man and the faith of many peoples. Through Keturah, we see the covenant's true nature. It was never about bloodline, but about blessing. And as we follow her legacy across the centuries, one truth emerges. God hides his greatest stories in the lives the world overlooks. But what does her story truly mean? What message lies beneath this divine symmetry, and why did God choose to multiply through silence? Keturah's story is not an appendix. It is a prophecy hidden in plain sight, disguised as genealogy, yet vibrating with divine intent. Every line of her story carries a whisper of something greater: restoration, expansion, redemption, beyond borders. She is the afterword of Abraham's covenant, but in truth, she is its echo, the sound of promise reverberating beyond the chosen nation. Where Sarah's womb birthed the covenant, Keturah's womb revealed its reach. Her 6 sons are not a number of chance 6, the number of completion before rest. Their names form a pattern of fulfillment, a hidden mirror to creation itself. As God finished his work on the 6th day, so too did Abraham's lineage find its fullness in 6 sons. Keturah stands as a living parable that God's blessings do not end where our understanding does. The covenant meant for one family was always designed to overflow into the nations. Her name, Keturah fragrance incense, is the symbol of worship rising from forgotten places. Incense was never burned in silence. It filled the tabernacle. It clung to the robes of the priests. It was the aroma that marked the presence of God. So too does her story rise from obscurity, from exile, from the edges of Scripture, to fill the divine narrative with an unseen sweetness. And perhaps that is the true revelation, that the forgotten are the fragrance. That God's glory is most evident not in power but in persistence in faith that survives anonymity. Keturah's story reveals a God who restores what others release, who calls life out of barrenness twice, and who plants new nations in the soil of silence. Her 6 sons mirror the 6 streams of promise spreading from Israel toward the ends of the earth, preparing the path for a greater covenant, one sealed not by circumcision, but by spirit. Through her we see that the covenant is not confined, it expands, multiplies, and transcends walls. It moves from tents to temples, from incense to intercession, from lineage to faith. Every forgotten name in Scripture exists to remind us that no life in God's plan is wasted, that what disappears from human record still lives in divine remembrance. Keturah's silence was not absence, it was prophecy. Her legacy was not lost, it was planted. And the fragrance of her faith still drifts through the corridors of redemption. But what does this prophecy mean for us here now? Could her hidden story carry a message for those who feel unseen, unchosen, or forgotten by God? What does this ancient story mean for us now in our world of noise, speed, and distraction? Why would Scripture preserve the name of a woman so silent, so hidden, so easily forgotten? Because within her silence lies the secret of endurance. Keturah teaches us that faith is not always loud. It is not always wrapped in miracles or fire from heaven. Sometimes it is a quiet obedience, the kind that blooms long after you are gone. The kind that shapes generations without ever being seen. Lesson 1. God never finishes when you think the story is over. Abraham thought his days were done. He had mourned Sarah, raised Isaac, and waited for death. But heaven still had a chapter left, a chapter written in the ink of impossibility. If God could birth nations through an old man's final breath, what could he still do through the remnants of your faith? Lesson 2. Your obedience may outlive you. Keturah never stood before kings, never parted seas, never saw her sons become nations. But her obedience set in motion the course of history, one that would one day protect Joseph, mentor Moses, and bless Israel. Sometimes your faith becomes someone else's miracle. Sometimes your yes today becomes another generation's breakthrough. Lesson 3. God's promises are bigger than your expectations, and they may take centuries to unfold. We live for immediacy. God works in eternity. The seeds you plant in tears may not bloom until long after your name is forgotten. But like Keturah, your legacy will still rise like incense, reaching places you will never walk. You may not see the end, but your faith writes the beginning. The fragrance of your obedience will fill the future long after your words are silent. So if you feel unseen, remember Keturah. If you think your story is over, remember Abraham. If you wonder whether God still moves in forgotten places, remember that even the quiet chapters carry divine fire. History is not written only by those who speak, but by those who endure. And sometimes the most powerful stories in Scripture are told by the ones who never utter a single word. Her story calls out across millennia, do not measure your worth by recognition. Measure it by faithfulness, because heaven remembers what earth forgets. And as her name fades into the fragrance of time, a final revelation waits to be uncovered, one that ties her story to the eternal heartbeat of redemption itself. Keturah's name means fragrance, and her life, like incense, rose quietly to heaven. While kingdoms fell and dynasties faded, her legacy endured, carried on the wind of prophecy. Through her, Abraham's story did not end, it expanded. Through her, God revealed that his promises reach far beyond bloodlines and borders, beyond what is seen into the unseen threads of his eternal design. Abraham thought his mission was complete, But God whispered through Keturah, "My covenant has no horizon." In her we see the rhythm of divine overflow, the way heaven continues its work long after men have laid down their plans. When the world says finished, God says begin again. When faith seems buried, he breathes upon the dust and calls it to rise. And when names vanish from memory, he writes them into eternity. Keturah's story is a reminder that the end of one chapter is the seed of another. Her sons scattered to the east were not lost, they were planted. Her silence was not emptiness, it was expectation. And her forgotten name was not erased, it was preserved for revelation. Perhaps you are a Keturah. Perhaps your season feels hidden, forgotten, quiet. But hiddenness does not mean insignificance. It means preparation. It means the fragrance of your life is still rising even when no one else can see the smoke. You are part of a larger covenant, one that began under the stars of and still unfolds today across the hearts of believers in every nation. From Abraham's tent to your life now, the same God still speaks, still restores, still multiplies what seemed finished. You are living proof that no story surrendered to God is ever lost. Your unseen obedience, your quiet prayers, your hidden faith, they ripple through time just as Keturah's did. So as her incense fades into history, let it awaken something in you, a call to believe again, to rise again, to begin again. If this story stirred something within you like the faint scent of incense in a forgotten tent, don't let it fade. Share and leave your reflection below, not as a comment, but as your offering of faith. Because when you speak, the story continues. And if you wish to journey deeper, stay for the message that follows, a quiet invitation made for those who have walked long with God, for those who still carry faith through the twilight of their years. The story of Keturah ends here, but her fragrance lives on. Perhaps that is the true meaning of Keturah's story, that life is not measured by how loudly we live, but by what we leave behind in the silence. To those who have walked long roads, who have seen dreams fade and seasons close, God is not finished with you. Your strength may wane, but your purpose does not. The faith you have carried through decades, the prayers you whispered in the night, the quiet wisdom you've passed to others, they are all part of a legacy still unfolding. Every breath of faith is a seed. Every act of kindness echoes in eternity. Every moment of endurance becomes a fragrance heaven remembers. You are not forgotten. You are the continuation of stories written before you were born. And one day others will walk in the shade of the trees you planted in faith. So walk gently, speak truth, love deeply, and let your life like Keturah's rise as incense before God. Because even in your twilight years, you are still part of his dawn. To live to believe and to leave behind the fragrance of faith. We began with a forgotten name, a woman hidden in the folds of Scripture, Keturah. But through her we discovered a truth that transcends centuries, that God's promises never fade, they simply wait for the right moment to bloom again. Her story reminds us that faith can be quiet yet eternal, that even in the last chapters of life, new beginnings can still rise like dawn over the desert. If this journey spoke to you, if it stirred memories, questions, or hope, leave your reflection below. Share what this story awakened in you, and let your words become part of the legacy. Share, and subscribe if you wish to keep walking this ancient path with us, where every forgotten story becomes a revelation. For the next mystery awaits. Another name, another hidden truth, and perhaps another piece of your own story, written in Scripture's dust.